Sure. My current position is a PhD position in the Department of Geography, where I intend to research land-based therapy. Part of that role allows me a great connection to Indigenous peoples at the university, but also in the community, in the larger community. But also I tend to interact with people from all nations and all ethnicities in regards to Indigenous peoples, topics, concerns, and whatnot. So my role for the last couple of years, and which has extended into this PhD position as well, is one of education, and working for the Aboriginal Resource Office as the Aboriginal Cultural Education Coordinator. I would offer services to students, staff, and faculty in an effort to bridge the gap between what should be talked about in academia, or should be shared information, the gap between what should be and what is. So in that position, I had about a dozen different portfolios, all geared towards broader education. And I've carried forward probably 2 or 3 of those portfolios into this new position. Those portfolios have to do with offering information sessions, trainings, experiential learning opportunities, and the like to the general academic community. So, depending on which group it is, like I said, we do training for students, staff, and faculty. Sometimes there's a mix of everybody, but sometimes it's very targeted to one of those groups. It could be anything from the very basics to who are the Indigenous people that live in this province, if you don't know that we're people here. And it could be about identifying territories, distinguishing one nation between another. At the very basic level, there's a lot of confusion around one Indigenous identity, this pan-Aboriginalism that's reinforced through the notion that all Native people are the same, right? That's very much alive in the common consciousness here, and for the most part in this province. So like I said, it could be very foundational like that, but part of what I do is I go in and kind of read a room, read the group, see where they're at, and start where they're at. It's almost like an ongoing assessment when you're teaching, and I learned that from my elders about meeting people where they're at and being able to give them the information they need. But that could go from the very basic information. It could go to points of history. It could go to anything from wellness practices. It could go to community development strategies. It could go to social work. It could go to pedagogy and education. Depending on what their request is and what their capacity is based on previous learning to kind of absorb some of the material presented and how it's presented. We can get very complex in a big hurry, right, if they're ready for it. Also, I said earlier, as I introduced myself, I'm a person of blended ancestry who identifies with the Inuit of Nunatsiavut, and the Labrador Inuit are not necessarily a ceremonial people. They do have a lot of cultural engagements and protocols, but not so much ceremony. But I did live a while out on the plains and on the west coast, and was honored to be allowed to participate in ceremony and then given permission to facilitate some of the ceremonies. So part of that pedagogy, or part of the learning opportunities that I and others like to create around academia is offering ceremony to people. That could be something as simple as a smudge. Not saying that the smudge ceremony is simple. It again is symbolic of very complex knowledge systems, but it could be facilitating smudge for people, or a number of different things that expose people to corrective information. So long story short, I typically respond to all requests and offer what I have, which can be very in-depth. But I'm also a good person that if I don't know the answer, I usually know who to reach out to facilitate that exchange. I think for us to be able to appropriately use the term Indigenous education, we have to be talking about not only what is being taught, like content, but also how things are being taught, pedagogy. I think Indigenous education sits in many different realms, and I think that if you embrace some of the traditional forms of knowledge dissemination, I think you would be more appropriately suited to that, say, category of Indigenous education. So, experiential learning opportunities, for example, land-based learning opportunities, knowledge dissemination between generations, a lot of different factors that extend far beyond just content. Content often, unfortunately, is delivered with an outside perspective. So also I think that true Indigenous education would come through an Aboriginal lens. It's funny, the common consciousness in Canada seems to think that Indigenous peoples don't value education, but that's quite the opposite of the reality of the situation. Unfortunately, there's been some terrible experiences with educational systems here in Canada, as I'm sure you know, but Indigenous people have always valued education, and a lot of the agreements between Indigenous nations and the Canadian government had to do with allowing access to educational institutions and whatnot. Come in the form of time and space. To have a place-based learning occur in a university setting, as opposed to in isolated pockets where this knowledge is still honored, but to have that come into the university. So for that to happen, first of all, you need corrective information, because what is being taught and how it's being taught doesn't represent the many truths that Indigenous peoples know. But also, once that corrective information comes and people embrace it, and for that to happen, there needs to be attitude change. An attitude change comes from moving away from this void in learning that pretty much amounts to obliviousness for in some cases. But once you have that corrective information, people can start establishing safer environments for these things to be discussed, learned, and taught in a way that's more consistent with both the reality of the history and current events, but also the truths as they're known elsewhere, right? Mm-hmm. I think that there's some major steps have been made in the last a little while, but it's far from a, say, post-colonial environment. I think that if we can separate power and knowledge, or knowledge from the power holders, I think we might be better able to reach success, more expediently anyway. I think that academia doesn't know what it's missing. And I think a lot of the voices have been dismissed or even actively suppressed, right? And that's, in my view, a consequence of a lot of residual negativity in the relationship between Indigenous and settler Canadians. But I think ideally academia would come to terms with the impact that Indigenous knowledge systems could have in this environment. Unfortunately, when an Indigenous person shows up to many of the universities in Atlantic Canada, let's say, they automatically assume, well, they're going to pursue Indigenous studies or anthropology or something. But there are many interests represented in traditional knowledge systems that are far beyond anthropology or archaeology. Indigenous statistics, engineering, Indigenous doctoring and helping, geography, all these different disciplines that can embrace Indigenous knowledge. And I think in 10 years, if I was king of everything, I think I'd want to see Indigenous knowledge represented as at least an option in every field, because a lot of these Indigenous knowledge systems are so complex that they could easily cross disciplines and have extremely valuable contributions to each. Right? Well, I think in this province, we're starting at the ground level, and I think that I say that in relation to my experience on the West Coast, where there is a lot of challenge in the relationship between Indigenous peoples and settlers, but they're moving in a direction, a positive direction, a lot faster, and they've made bigger strides than we have in this province. Unfortunately, there is still a very big gap or void, as I said earlier, in what people know, and you can't expect them to be aware fully of the situation as it's been kept out of the history books. People don't have any previous exposure or learning opportunities, so a lot of times there's misinformation circulates, and I've had professors ask me if there were Indigenous people in the province. Somebody that has gone through their PhD, somebody that has published enough to acquire a faculty position, isn't aware that there's Indigenous peoples in this province, right? So that's just an example of how far we have to go. What I think we need is to start embracing learning opportunities at the primary and secondary level. So when people enter the post-secondary institutions, they have at least a little bit of knowledge to build upon. Mm-hmm. And I think that starting early, even if it's starting with people that are just entering first-year students, right, just entering university, starting to work with them to correct some of the misconceptions, address some of the myths, and I think that would go a long way towards changing attitudes, attitudes that prevent a safe learning environment, right? So with regards to what is needed, there's tons. I could write a long list, but I think if we think about the foundational engagement of new students in activities that reduce stereotypes, dispel myths, and correct poor attitude, right? Because you can't expect people to know everything coming through the door when they've never had the opportunity to learn. And obliviousness is easy to forgive, but when you pair it with a bad attitude, it's not so easy to forgive, and it becomes problematic for all learners then.